The flashlight beam shook as it crossed frozen leaves, catching a pale shape where no one should have been, the silence broken only by wind through bare branches. And in that suspended second, investigators understood that the winter woods were about to surrender a truth buried for decades at last. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on the final weekend of December 1997, outside the small Appalachian town of Elkins, West Virginia, where snow lingered in shaded hollows, and the year was winding down in the quiet, reflective way familiar to anyone who had watched many winters pass. The victim was later identified as Emily Jane Harper, 22 years old, a local woman whose name had faded from front pages but never fully left courthouse ledgers or family conversations. Her remains were found in a wooded ravine near a secondary road used mostly by hunters and state trucks, an area that had been searched before but never with the benefit of time's erosion and a new set of eyes. Emily Harper had been reported missing just after Thanksgiving in 1997. She was last seen leaving a late shift at a diner off U.S. Route 219, the kind of place that stayed open through holidays because truckers still drove and snow still fell. Her car was found 2 days later in a grocery store parking lot, unlocked, keys missing, a thin crust of snow already settling on the windshield. Police records from the period describe a routine response shaped by the era: door-to-door checks, flyers pinned to corkboards in post offices, a short segment on local television before Christmas programming took over. There was no sign of forced struggle at the vehicle, no immediate witnesses, and no clear direction for the investigation to follow. The initial missing persons file reflects the limitations of the time. Cellular phone records were sparse, security cameras rare, and forensic databases far less interconnected than they would become decades later. Officers interviewed coworkers, family members, and regular patrons of the diner, reconstructing Emily's final days with careful neutrality. She was described as reliable, planning to enroll in community college courses in the spring, and expected home for Thanksgiving leftovers the next morning. When those plans went unfulfilled, concern grew quickly but without the urgency that hindsight would later demand. Winter closed in hard that year. Snowstorms layered the hills, and search efforts slowed as terrain became treacherous. By New Year's Day, the case shifted from active search to long-term investigation, a quiet administrative change that older investigators know too well. Boxes were labeled, evidence sealed, and the Harper file joined hundreds of others in the county archives, pulled occasionally when tips arrived, then returned to cold storage when they led nowhere. The autopsy conducted after the December discovery in 1997 provided limited but critical information. The medical examiner noted evidence consistent with homicide, though decomposition and environmental exposure restricted definitive conclusions. Time of death was estimated within days of Emily's disappearance. There were no defensive wounds that could be reliably documented, and no identifiable murder weapon recovered from the scene. Clothing fibers and trace materials were collected and logged, preserved in sealed envelopes that would not be reopened for years. Media coverage at the time was restrained, reflecting both the town's size and the sensibilities of the period. The local paper ran a short article noting the discovery, connecting it to the earlier missing person report, and quoting a sheriff's statement that the investigation remained ongoing. By mid-January, attention shifted back to winter road conditions, school delays, and the slow rhythm of a rural county accustomed to hardship and patience. For the next 2 decades, Emily Harper's case remained unsolved. Investigators retired, witnesses moved or passed away, and memories softened at the edges. Yet the file was never destroyed. It sat in a climate-controlled room in the county courthouse, alongside tax records and land deeds, its manila cover bearing handwritten notes in different inks, a physical record of persistence. Periodic reviews occurred, often prompted by anniversaries or the arrival of new technology discussed at state conferences. The break came quietly in 2018, initiated not by a confession or a dramatic tip, but by a systematic cold case review program adopted statewide. A younger detective, tasked with re-examining unresolved homicides from the 1990s, requested the Harper file. He noted the preservation quality of the biological samples and requested advanced DNA testing unavailable in 1997. Approval took months, budgets debated in county meetings that drew little attention, but eventually the samples were sent to a state lab partnered with a national forensic database. Results returned in stages. The first report confirmed that viable DNA had been recovered from Emily's clothing. The second report indicated a partial profile suitable for genealogical comparison. Investigators followed established legal protocols, obtaining warrants and ensuring compliance with privacy standards that had evolved significantly since the original investigation. The process was slow, deliberate, and documented in detail, mindful of the scrutiny that would follow any arrest made so many years later. By early 2020, analysts identified a potential familial match pointing toward a man who had lived in Randolph County in the late 1990s, but relocated shortly after Emily's disappearance. His name was Thomas Allen Reed, then 34 years old, now approaching retirement age himself. Records showed minor prior offenses, nothing violent, and employment that placed him near the diner on the night Emily was last seen. Investigators reconstructed his movements using archived employment logs, weather reports, and surviving witness statements, many of which took on new meaning under renewed examination. Surveillance was conducted discreetly. Reed was interviewed under the pretense of routine follow-up, his statements compared against those he had given informally in 1997. Inconsistencies emerged, small but cumulative, regarding timelines and locations during the Thanksgiving weekend. A discarded coffee cup provided a fresh DNA sample, legally obtained and matched conclusively to the profile from the crime scene. The arrest occurred in November 2021, just before Thanksgiving, a deliberate choice by authorities to ensure full staffing and media coordination. Reed was taken into custody without incident. The announcement sent a subdued shock through the community, especially among those who remembered Emily Harper as a young woman with her life ahead of her. Court documents laid out the evidence methodically, emphasizing chain of custody, laboratory validation, and corroborating circumstantial details. The trial concluded in late 2022. Reed was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after a statutory minimum. There were no outbursts, no dramatic scenes, only the steady recitation of facts and the quiet acknowledgement of loss. In the aftermath, the Harper family issued a brief statement expressing gratitude for the persistence of investigators and the resolution of long uncertainty. Today, Emily Harper's name appears in a closed case registry, her story occasionally referenced in training materials for cold case units. In Elkins, winters still arrive with snow and silence, and older men read the local paper by the heater, noting how time can pass and still circle back. The woods where she was found have grown thicker, but the truth they held has finally been brought into the open, recorded, and set to rest within the careful order of the law. As the case moved beyond the initial arrest, investigators returned again to the physical geography of Randolph County, documenting how Emily Harper's final movements intersected with the routines of a working Appalachian town. Roads that curved through spruce and oak, gas stations that closed early in winter, and a diner whose lights cut through snowstorms all became part of a reconstructed timeline. Police logs from November 1997 were reviewed line by line, not for what they contained, but for what they lacked, the empty hours where assumptions had once replaced certainty. Those gaps, ignored in the urgency of a fresh disappearance, now formed the skeleton of a more disciplined analysis. The renewed investigation placed particular emphasis on Thanksgiving week, a period when routines are disrupted and absences more easily excused. Employment records showed Emily worked additional hours leading up to the holiday, covering for coworkers traveling to see family. Time cards confirmed her final shift ended shortly before midnight, a fact corroborated by a now-retired supervisor whose memory had remained unusually precise. Weather reports indicated light snowfall beginning after 1 a.m., enough to soften tire impressions by morning, explaining why no clear vehicle tracks were noted during the original search. Thomas Allen Reed's proximity to these details grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. In 1997, he worked as a delivery driver for a regional distributor, a job that required late hours and familiarity with back roads. Fuel receipts recovered from archived company files placed him near Elkins on the night Emily vanished. At the time, that information had seemed unremarkable, one data point among many. 2 decades later, it aligned too closely with the emerging forensic picture to ignore. Investigators also revisited witness interviews conducted during the first week of the disappearance. Several individuals had reported seeing a dark-colored pickup near the diner parking lot, idling longer than necessary. No license plate had been recorded, and the description matched numerous vehicles in the county. Reed owned such a truck in 1997, later sold and scrapped, a transaction documented but never previously connected to the case. The convergence of these factors did not prove guilt, but they justified further scrutiny under modern standards. Forensic reanalysis extended beyond DNA. Soil samples collected from Emily's clothing were compared to geological surveys of the area. While not definitive, the mineral composition was consistent with the ravine where her remains were found, reinforcing the conclusion that she had been taken directly to that location rather than moved later. Fiber analysis identified traces consistent with the interior upholstery common in Reed's model of vehicle, a finding presented cautiously but supported by expert testimony. Throughout this process, investigators maintained meticulous documentation, anticipating the challenges inherent in prosecuting a decades-old crime. Every transfer of evidence was logged, every laboratory method validated against current accreditation requirements. Defense counsel would later question memory reliability and evidence degradation, arguments expected and addressed in advance by the prosecution's methodical approach. Media attention increased as details emerged, but coverage remained restrained. Local newspapers emphasized procedure over speculation, reflecting a readership familiar with patience and wary of sensational claims. For many older residents, the case evoked memories of where they had been when Emily disappeared, anchoring personal histories to a shared, unresolved question. The arrest did not reopen old wounds so much as acknowledge they had never fully healed. The pretrial phase extended through multiple seasons, each marked by routine court filings and status hearings that rarely made headlines. Winter returned, snow accumulating outside the courthouse where Emily's file had rested for so long. Inside, clerks retrieved documents last handled by colleagues long since retired, the paper bearing the faint smell of storage and age. It was a tangible reminder of institutional memory, preserved even when human recollection fades. Expert witnesses prepared to explain genealogical DNA analysis to a jury likely unfamiliar with its nuances. Care was taken to clarify that the technique supplemented, rather than replaced, traditional investigative work. The prosecution's case rested not on a single breakthrough, but on the convergence of independent lines of evidence, each reinforcing the others. This cumulative structure reflected lessons learned from earlier cold cases, where over-reliance on novel science had proven vulnerable on appeal. When the trial finally commenced, it did so without spectacle. Jury selection focused on impartiality rather than emotion, an acknowledgement of the community's proximity to the events. Testimony proceeded in chronological order, reconstructing Emily Harper's final days with a restraint that mirrored the investigation itself. Autopsy findings were presented clinically, emphasizing limitations as much as conclusions, an honesty that strengthened credibility rather than undermining it. Reed's defense challenged the reliability of long-delayed witness recollections and questioned the preservation of evidence. These arguments were addressed through documentation and expert explanation, demonstrating continuity of custody and consistency of results across independent tests. The court record reflects careful judicial oversight, ensuring that each evidentiary step met contemporary legal standards despite the case's age. As proceedings continued into late autumn, the jury was reminded repeatedly of the burden of proof and the necessity of separating sympathy from fact. Observers noted the absence of emotional displays, a tone shaped perhaps by the passage of time and the maturity of those involved. Many jurors were older men themselves, accustomed to evaluating claims against the steady accumulation of experience. The verdict, delivered after deliberation that extended over several days, confirmed the prosecution's case. Thomas Allen Reed was found guilty, the conclusion reached not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet alignment of evidence. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the constraints imposed by law. In the weeks after sentencing, attention turned briefly to the implications for other unsolved cases. State officials cited the Harper investigation as an example of the value of sustained evidence preservation and periodic review. Training seminars referenced its procedural rigor, emphasizing that resolution often emerges from patience rather than innovation alone. For Emily Harper's family, closure arrived without fanfare. They declined extended interviews, issuing a simple statement acknowledging the outcome and requesting privacy. Their response resonated with many who understood that justice, while necessary, does not restore what was lost. It merely defines the truth within an official record. As another year ended and winter settled again over the hills of West Virginia, the Harper case transitioned from active docket to archival history. The ravine where her remains were found lay quiet beneath snow, indistinguishable from countless others. Yet within courthouse files and investigative manuals, her story endured, a reminder that time does not erase accountability, and that even in small towns, the past remains subject to careful, persistent examination. Following the verdict, the investigative record did not close immediately, because appellate safeguards and administrative reviews required months of additional work. Clerks assembled transcripts, exhibits were cataloged again, and laboratory certifications were appended to the file. This phase mattered to older observers who understood that justice survives only when procedure survives scrutiny, especially in cases revived from another era. Attention returned to the earliest hours after Emily Harper vanished, not to relitigate guilt, but to understand why the case had stalled. Analysts compared 1997 practices to modern protocols, noting how limited patrol staffing during holiday weekends constrained canvassing. Thanksgiving had scattered families, delayed reports, and thin traffic patterns, producing a landscape where absence did not immediately signal danger. Snowfall then erased fragile traces before daylight searches began. Investigators documented how missing person flyers traveled slowly in rural West Virginia. Bulletin boards in feed stores and volunteer fire departments carried notices weeks late. Radio announcements reached hollows where reception faded. These factors were not failures, but realities of geography and season that shaped outcomes. The review emphasized that cold cases are often born from context rather than neglect. Reed's sentencing included victim impact submissions read into the record without theatrics. They described Emily as a daughter and sister who marked holidays with consistency, calling home, saving recipes, planning small gatherings. Such details grounded the case in ordinary life, a perspective resonant with jurors who measured years by family calendars and weather cycles. Post-conviction testing requests were denied after independent verification confirmed the original findings. The court cited adherence to nationally recognized standards, including blind retesting and chain audits. These decisions reduced the likelihood of prolonged appeals, an outcome that spared the community extended uncertainty while preserving the defendant's legal rights. The sheriff's department undertook a quiet inventory of other dormant files. Storage rooms were reorganized, humidity controls upgraded, and digitization accelerated. The Harper case justified budget allocations that rarely draw attention, yet determine whether evidence remains viable decades later. Older residents recognized the practical wisdom of maintenance over spectacle. Local press coverage shifted toward explanatory reporting, outlining how genealogical databases operate within legal limits. Articles clarified consent frameworks and warrant requirements, countering misconceptions fueled elsewhere. This educational approach reflected a readership cautious about change but receptive to careful explanation. Winter weather continued to frame public memory. Snowfall on courthouse steps during post-trial hearings echoed the conditions surrounding Emily's disappearance. Photographs showed no crowds, only routine foot traffic and the steady presence of county employees. The ordinariness underscored how resolution can arrive without ceremony. In Elkins, the diner where Emily last worked changed ownership. Renovations replaced booths, but the location remained identifiable by its angled parking and view of the road. Patrons mentioned the case less often as time passed, though it lingered as a reference point when discussing how communities remember. Investigators compiled a comprehensive timeline appendix, aligning payroll logs, fuel receipts, weather data, and witness statements. This document became a training resource, demonstrating how disparate records can converge. Emphasis was placed on corroboration across independent sources, a principle older professionals recognize from long experience. The medical examiner's office updated its archival practices as well. Emily's autopsy file was reviewed for completeness, then digitized with annotations explaining limitations imposed by decomposition and exposure. Transparency about uncertainty was treated as a strength, reinforcing trust in conclusions drawn carefully. Reed entered state custody and was assigned to a facility appropriate to his age and health. Intake assessments noted no extraordinary issues. He declined public comment, and officials refrained from speculation. The absence of spectacle allowed the case to settle into administrative normalcy. Community discussions focused briefly on safety practices for late shift workers. Employers adjusted lighting and escort policies, modest changes shaped by hindsight rather than fear. The response was pragmatic, avoiding alarm while acknowledging vulnerability during winter nights. As another Thanksgiving approached, the Harper family marked the holiday privately. There were no public memorials, only routine observances that reflected a desire to move forward without erasing memory. Closure, in this sense, meant the ability to plan seasons without unresolved questions. Statewide conferences cited the case as evidence that patience, documentation, and lawful innovation can coexist. Presentations avoided triumphal language, stressing that resolution often arrives incrementally. Attendees, many nearing retirement, nodded at lessons aligning with careers spent valuing diligence. The county archive assigned a permanent reference code to the Harper file. Access protocols balanced transparency with sensitivity, permitting scholarly review while protecting personal data. This stewardship acknowledged that cases, once solved, still belong to public history. Snow melted into early spring, revealing the ravine unchanged. Investigators visited once more to confirm records, then closed the site log. Nature offered no commentary, only continuity. In the end, the Harper case illustrated how time reshapes evidence without negating it. Through careful preservation and renewed attention, a quiet truth emerged, affirmed by process rather than drama. For those who had lived long enough to see cycles repeat, the outcome reinforced a familiar understanding. Resolution favors the steady, and winter eventually yields its answers. Legal analysts later summarized the case in journals read by prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, emphasizing restraint. They noted how investigators resisted shortcuts, opting instead for layered corroboration. This approach reduced error and strengthened legitimacy. For practitioners seasoned by decades in courtrooms, the lesson was familiar yet reaffirmed. Credibility accrues through patience, and restraint often persuades more effectively than forceful rhetoric. Records show that the jury foreperson requested repeated readbacks of technical testimony, particularly concerning timelines and laboratory controls. This behavior reflected seriousness rather than confusion. Older jurors, accustomed to evaluating equipment manuals and maintenance logs, appeared attentive to process. Post-trial interviews conducted by the court indicated that deliberations centered on consistency across records, not personality or conjecture. The sentencing memorandum detailed statutory considerations, including elapsed time and the defendant's age. It balanced punishment with public safety, adhering strictly to legislative guidance. Observers noted the absence of rhetorical flourish. The document read like an operations manual, precise and unemotional, reflecting an institutional preference for durability over display, a sensibility familiar to those who value systems that work quietly. Archival photographs appended to the file showed winter roads bordered by plowed banks and bare trees. These images contextualized travel times and visibility, supporting expert conclusions. They also captured a period aesthetic, vehicles and signage now dated. For long-time residents, the images triggered recognition without nostalgia, reinforcing how environments influence behavior. The prosecutor's office instituted a peer review checklist modeled on the Harper prosecution. Each step required sign-off, ensuring redundancy. Critics argued it slowed workflow, but administrators countered that deliberation prevents error. Over time, the checklist became routine, another quiet control embedded into daily practice. Community memory adjusted gradually. School assemblies mentioned safety in general terms, avoiding specifics. Churches offered counseling referrals during winter months. None of this carried Emily's name publicly, an intentional choice reflecting respect. The emphasis was forward-looking, shaped by the belief that remembrance need not be performative to be sincere. State funding reports cited measurable returns from cold case investments, including solved cases and deterrence effects. While causation remained complex, policymakers favored tangible outcomes. The Harper case provided a narrative anchored in verification, useful in committee hearings where skepticism runs high. Defense counsel filed a notice preserving issues for appeal, a procedural step rather than a forecast. The appellate court later affirmed the conviction, citing overwhelming corroboration and lawful methods. The opinion was concise, reinforcing finality through clarity. With appeals exhausted, records were sealed according to schedule. Researchers requesting access encountered clear pathways, balancing openness and dignity. The system functioned as designed, neither hiding nor exploiting the past. Winter returned again, quieter now that uncertainty had lifted. Snowplows traced familiar routes, and calendars turned without footnotes. For a generation that measures time in seasons, the absence of an unanswered question mattered. The Harper file occupied a modest shelf, neither prominent nor forgotten. Its tabs were neat, its index complete. Such orderliness spoke to an ethic older professionals recognize. Do the work thoroughly, then let the record stand. Looking back, the case resolved not through revelation but accumulation, a method consistent with professional norms. Each verified fact added weight until the balance tipped, resisting narrative shortcuts. This manner of ending suited a community accustomed to incremental progress, where maintenance and record-keeping matter. It affirmed that patience, when paired with stewardship, can outlast time, weather, and doubt, providing answers without spectacle and lessons, without slogans for those who have watched many seasons turn. The quiet aftermath persisted, measured in routine and paperwork rather than headlines, as calendars advanced and offices reopened after storms. Files closed, staff rotated, and the system continued without commentary. For an older audience, that continuity carried meaning, signaling that institutions endure when they are tended carefully, and that resolution, once achieved lawfully, can rest without needing reinforcement. In this way, the case concluded fully, its lessons preserved, its questions answered, and its place fixed within the patient record of a small American county across generations and seasons remembered by locals. As years passed after the appellate decision, the Harper case gradually assumed its final form within the institutional memory of West Virginia law enforcement. It was no longer referenced as a tragedy in progress, but as a completed investigation, cited carefully and without embellishment. Training manuals summarized it in neutral language, focusing on preservation, sequencing, and restraint. The emotional weight remained, but it was carried privately rather than displayed. County officials noted that public trust had shifted subtly. Residents who had once doubted whether old cases mattered saw proof that records kept properly could speak decades later. This was not framed as redemption, but as validation of routine competence. For older men who had worked in factories, mines, or public service, the message resonated. Steady effort accumulates value over time. The courthouse itself bore quiet marks of the case's closure. File rooms were reorganized to prioritize cold cases with retained biological evidence. Climate control systems were upgraded, not as a memorial but as infrastructure. Maintenance logs reflected the same philosophy that governed the Harper investigation's conclusion. Avoid neglect, document everything, expect scrutiny. Emily Harper's name appeared only occasionally in public discourse. When it did, it was usually in the context of procedural reform rather than personal story. This restraint aligned with the family's wishes and with a broader cultural preference for privacy. In a town where people measured character by conduct rather than words, Silence carried respect. Law enforcement leadership rotated, yet the case briefing remained part of onboarding. New detectives read summaries, examined timelines, and learned how assumptions made under seasonal pressure can delay clarity. Thanksgiving scheduling conflicts, winter staffing shortages, and rural distances were discussed as operational realities, not excuses. The emphasis remained on anticipating these factors rather than reacting to them. The diner near Route 219 eventually closed, replaced by a hardware outlet. Its parking lot was resurfaced, erasing physical traces of the night Emily vanished. Yet aerial photographs archived by the county preserved the original layout. These images continued to support training exercises, demonstrating how ordinary locations can become pivotal without warning. Community members occasionally asked whether more arrests might follow. Officials answered consistently that evidence supported a single perpetrator. Transparency in this regard prevented speculation from taking root. The clarity mattered, particularly to those who valued closure as a condition for moving forward. Reed's incarceration proceeded without incident. Annual reviews noted compliance and declining health consistent with age. He pursued no public platform, and authorities discouraged commentary. The case remained defined by evidence, not personality. This approach minimized secondary harm and preserved the integrity of the verdict. Academic reviews published years later cited the Harper case when discussing the maturation of forensic genealogy standards. Authors highlighted the importance of warrants, minimization procedures, and corroboration. The case was neither the first nor the most dramatic, but it was exemplary in execution. That distinction mattered to practitioners who favored reliability over novelty. Seasonal rhythms continued to shape memory. Each winter, as snow returned to the hills, local newspapers ran reflective pieces about preparedness and continuity. Occasionally, a paragraph referenced resolved cold cases as evidence that time does not erase responsibility. Emily Harper's name might appear once, then recede again into the archive. The ravine where her remains were found became indistinguishable from surrounding terrain. No marker identified it, and none was requested. Nature reclaimed the space fully. Investigators considered this appropriate, allowing the land to return to anonymity while the record preserved the truth. Within the sheriff's department, a small plaque listed solved cold cases by year. It did not include names or details, only dates. The Harper case appeared as an entry, understated. Visitors rarely noticed it, but staff understood its significance. It represented work completed correctly. Periodic audits confirmed that evidence retention policies introduced after the case were functioning. Samples were logged, tracked, and reviewed. These audits generated no headlines, but they reduced risk. Older professionals recognized the value of systems that operate without attention, a hallmark of effective design. The Harper family relocated quietly, maintaining limited contact with local officials. They expressed appreciation when asked, but avoided ceremonies. Their preference influenced how agencies approached victim relations in other cases, prioritizing consent over display. At statewide meetings, officials discussed funding in practical terms. Cold casework was described as maintenance rather than rescue. This framing secured stable support. Legislators accustomed to infrastructure budgets understood the analogy. Roads, like records, fail when ignored. Over time, the case's emotional intensity softened into historical gravity. It became part of the county's story, referenced without drama. For residents who had lived through the original winter of 1997, the resolution offered a sense of alignment, as if an account long open had finally been balanced. The appellate court's opinion continued to be cited for its clarity. It addressed evidentiary delay without dismissing relevance, affirming that age alone does not weaken proof when custody and method are sound. This principle influenced subsequent rulings, extending the case's impact beyond its facts. As retirement ceremonies occurred for officers who had touched the file at different stages, the Harper case surfaced in speeches only briefly. It was mentioned as an example of perseverance rather than triumph. Such framing reflected a professional culture wary of celebration in matters involving loss. The county archive expanded, adding digital redundancies and standardized metadata. Emily Harper's file was among the first fully cross-indexed. Researchers accessing it decades later would encounter a complete narrative, free from gaps. That completeness was intentional, the final obligation of those who managed it. Public memory eventually settled. New generations knew the case only through institutional reference. The absence of rumor testified to careful communication. In communities where stories often grow with retelling, restraint preserved accuracy. As winter followed winter, the lessons endured. Investigations benefit from patience. Records matter. Seasons complicate timelines. Truth emerges incrementally when systems are maintained. These were not revelations, but confirmations, familiar to those who had spent lives maintaining machinery, accounts, or public trust. In the quiet aftermath, the Harper case exemplified resolution achieved without spectacle. Its conclusion rested not on confession or chance, but on methodical linkage verified over time. For an audience accustomed to valuing work done correctly and quietly, that ending felt appropriate. The record closed, the shelf settled, and the county continued. Snow fell, holidays passed, and routines resumed. Within that continuity lay the final measure of justice. The case no longer demanded attention, because it had been answered fully, lawfully, and with care, leaving behind a complete account rather than an open question. The final phase of the Harper case unfolded without public notice, marked by administrative closure rather than ceremony. Files were stamped complete, digital mirrors confirmed, and access permissions set according to statute. What remained was not momentum, but stability, the condition sought from the beginning. For those who had followed the case across decades, that stability mattered more than acknowledgement. Institutional reviews concluded that no further investigative steps were warranted. All evidentiary avenues had been exhausted, and the record supported the conviction without reliance on speculation. This determination was documented formally, ensuring that future reviewers would encounter a clear endpoint rather than ambiguity. Older professionals recognized the importance of endings that do not invite reinterpretation. The courthouse resumed its ordinary rhythm. Calendars advanced through winter, past New Year, and into another spring without the case reappearing on dockets. Clerks processed routine filings, jurors reported for unrelated matters, and the building's routines absorbed the conclusion quietly. The absence of disruption signaled success measured by continuity. Training programs retained the Harper case as a reference but reduced its prominence over time. Newer examples supplemented it, reflecting evolving technology and standards. Yet its core lessons remained intact: preserve evidence, document context, revisit assumptions, and proceed lawfully. These principles transcended the particulars of any single case. In Elkins, conversations shifted. The case was no longer mentioned when discussing safety or memory. Instead, it surfaced occasionally when people spoke about patience or record-keeping, abstracted from its origin. This abstraction allowed the community to integrate the outcome without reliving the loss. The Harper family maintained their distance, their wishes respected. Correspondence from agencies ceased except for legally required notifications. The restraint demonstrated that closure includes knowing when to step back. For many, this discretion reflected maturity rather than indifference. Annual reports from the Sheriff's Department listed solved cases numerically, without elaboration. The Harper case appeared as one line among others, its resolution contributing to a broader pattern rather than standing apart. This normalization affirmed that justice, once achieved, belongs within the system rather than above it. Academic references continued briefly, then tapered. The case's methodological soundness rendered it uncontroversial, reducing incentive for debate. Scholars moved on, satisfied that the record supported their analyses. The quiet consensus contrasted with more sensational cases, underscoring the value of restraint. The physical environment continued unchanged. Snow returned each winter, accumulating along roads and settling into wooded ravines. Weather reports marked familiar cycles. For those who remembered 1997, the similarity reinforced how circumstances repeat even as outcomes differ. This repetition offered perspective rather than sorrow. Reed's incarceration entered its routine phase. Annual reviews noted progression consistent with policy. No further legal challenges altered the sentence. The system absorbed him without commentary, focusing on management rather than narrative. This neutrality preserved the focus on outcome rather than individual. Policy reviews confirmed that the genealogical methods used complied with evolving standards. Subsequent cases referenced these benchmarks. The Harper case thus influenced practice indirectly, shaping procedures rather than headlines. Its impact lay in calibration, not innovation. The county archives scheduled periodic audits, including random checks of closed cases. Harper's file consistently met criteria. Such audits rarely attract attention, yet they safeguard institutional memory. Older professionals understand that maintenance prevents decay. Public education materials cited cold cases generally, avoiding specifics. This approach balanced transparency with respect. It reinforced trust without reopening wounds. The Harper case's inclusion remained implicit rather than explicit. Over time, generational turnover reduced personal connection. New residents knew the town without association to the case. This fatting was not erasure, but integration into history. The record remained accessible, but memory no longer demanded attention. Legal practitioners occasionally referenced the appellate opinion for its clarity. Its concise reasoning became a model for addressing delayed evidence without prejudice. This technical influence extended the case's reach subtly, shaping jurisprudence beyond its jurisdiction. Seasonal markers continued to frame reflection. Thanksgiving passed with familiar rituals, New Year arrived with routine resolutions. The absence of unresolved questions allowed these moments to proceed without undercurrent. Closure manifested as normalcy. Community institutions adjusted policies incrementally. Lighting improvements, escort options, and scheduling awareness became standard. These measures were adopted broadly, not attributed to a single event. This diffusion reflected a preference for practical improvement over symbolic response. The Harper case no longer occupied training seminars exclusively. It joined a body of examples illustrating diligence. Its prominence diminished not because it lacked importance, but because its lessons were absorbed. Effective instruction eventually becomes background. As years accumulated, the case's narrative simplified. It became known as a solved cold case, resolved through patience and preservation. Details receded, leaving principles. This distillation suited an audience that values substance over story. The final archival note summarized closure succinctly, referencing conviction, appeal affirmation, and sentence. No commentary followed. The file rested complete, its contents unchanged. Such finality mattered to those who trust systems that conclude decisively. In reflecting on the outcome, observers noted that resolution did not restore loss, but it corrected the record. For older men who had seen projects finish imperfectly yet acceptably, this distinction resonated. Completion does not imply satisfaction, only accountability. The town continued its cycles. Roads were maintained, schools operated, elections held. The Harper case did not define identity. It existed as one thread in a larger fabric, acknowledged without dominance. This balance reflected communal resilience. Ultimately, the case concluded as it had proceeded, methodically, without spectacle. Its solution emerged from accumulation rather than revelation. For those attuned to process, this outcome affirmed that careful stewardship endures. The quiet aftermath persisted. No anniversaries prompted statements. No documentaries sought commentary. The record stood sufficient. In this sufficiency lay the final measure of justice, an answer that required no reinforcement. As winter yielded to spring once more, the hills greened and routines resumed. The Harper case remained closed, its lessons embedded. Time continued, indifferent yet accommodating. The system held. In the end, the story resolved fully within the law's framework, leaving behind a complete account rather than a lingering question. That completeness, achieved patiently and preserved carefully, marked the true conclusion, allowing the community, the institutions, and the record itself to move forward without reservation, confident that the truth had been established, documented, and allowed to rest.